Book 2, Chapter 6 of On War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. On War by Karl von Clausewitz. Translated by Colonel J. J. Graham. Chapter 6. On Examples. Examples from history make everything clear and furnish the best description of proof in the empirical sciences. This applies with more force to the art of war than any other. General Scharnhorst, whose handbook is the best ever written on actual war, pronounces historical examples to be of the first importance, and makes an admirable use of them himself. Had he survived the war in which he fell, the fourth part of his revised treatise on artillery would have given a still greater proof of the observing and enlightened spirit in which he sifted matters of experience. But such use of historical examples is rarely made by theoretical writers. The way in which they more commonly make use of them is rather calculated to leave the mind unsatisfied, as well as to offend the understanding. We therefore think it important to bring specially into view the use and abuse of historical examples. Unquestionably, the branches of knowledge which lie at the foundation of the art of war come under the denomination of empirical sciences, for although they are derived in a great measure from the nature of things, still we can only learn this very nature itself for the most part from experience, and besides that, the practical application is modified by so many circumstances that the effects can never be completely learnt from the mere nature of the means. The effects of gunpowder, that great agent in our military activity, were only learnt by experience, and up to this hour experiments are continually in progress in order to investigate them more fully. That an iron ball, to which powder has given a velocity of 1,000 feet in a second, smashes every living thing which it touches in its course is intelligible in itself. Experience is not required to tell us that. But in producing this effect, how many hundred circumstances are concerned, some of which can only be learnt by experience. And the physical is not the only effect which we have to study, it is the moral which we are in search of, and that can only be ascertained by experience, and there is no other way of learning and appreciating it but by experience. In the Middle Ages, when firearms were first invented, their effect, owing to their rude make, was materially but trifling compared to what it is now, but their effect morally was much greater. One must have witnessed the firmness of one of those masses taught and led by Bonaparte, under the heaviest and most unintermittent cannonade, in order to understand what troops, hardened by long practice in the field of danger, can do, when by a career of victory they have reached the noble principle of demanding from themselves their utmost efforts. In pure conception, none would believe it. On the other hand, it is well known that there are troops in the service of the European powers at the present moment who would easily be dispersed by a few cannon shots. But no empirical science, consequently also no theory of the art of war, can always corroborate its truths by historical proof. It would also be, in some measure, difficult to support experience by single facts. If any means is once found efficacious in war, it is repeated, one nation copies another, the thing becomes the fashion, and in this matter it comes into use, supported by experience, and takes its place in theory, which contents itself with appealing to experience in general in order to show its origin, but not as verification of its truth. But it is quite otherwise if experience is to be used in order to overthrow some means in use, to confirm what is doubtful or introduce something new. Then particular examples from history must be quoted as proofs. Now if we consider closely the use of historical proofs, 4 points of view readily present themselves for our purpose. First, they may be used merely as an explanation of an idea. In every abstract consideration it is very easy to be misunderstood, or not to be intelligible at all. When an author is afraid of this, an exemplification from history serves to throw the light which is wanted on his idea, and to ensure his being intelligible to his reader. Secondly, it may serve as an application of an idea, because by means of an example there is an opportunity of showing the action of those minor circumstances which cannot all be comprehended and explained in any general expression of an idea, for in that consists indeed the difference between theory and experience. Both these cases belong to examples, properly speaking. The two following belong to historical proofs. Thirdly, a historical fact may be referred to particularly in order only to support what one has advanced. This is in all cases sufficient if we have only to prove the possibility of a fact or effect. Lastly, in the fourth place, from the circumstantial detail of a historical event, and by collecting together several of them, we may deduce some theory, which therefore has its true proof in this testimony itself. For the first of these purposes, all that is generally required is a cursory notice of the case, as it has only been used partially. Historical correctness is a secondary consideration. A case invented might also serve the purpose as well, only historical ones are always to be preferred, because they bring the idea, which they illustrate, nearer to practical life. The second use supposes a more circumstantial relation of events, but historical authenticity is again of secondary importance, and in respect to this point, the same is to be said as in the first case. For the third purpose, the mere quotation of an undoubted fact is generally sufficient. If it is asserted that fortified positions may fulfil their object under certain conditions, it is only necessary to mention the position of Bunzelwitz in support of the assertion. But if through the narrative of a case in history an abstract truth is to be demonstrated, then everything in the case bearing on the demonstration must be analysed in the most searching and complete manner. It must to a certain extent develop itself carefully before the eyes of the reader. The less effectually this is done, the weaker will be the proof, and the more necessary it will be to supply the demonstrative proof which is wanting in the single case by a number of cases, because we have a right to suppose that the more minute details, which we are unable to give, neutralise each other in their effects in a certain number of cases. If we want to show by example derived from experience that cavalry are better placed behind than in a line with infantry, that it is very hazardous without a decided preponderance of numbers to attempt an enveloping movement with widely separated columns, either on a field of battle or in the theatre of war, that is, either tactically or strategically, then in the first of these cases it would not be sufficient to specify some lost battles in which the cavalry was on the flanks, and some gained in which the cavalry was in the rear of the infantry. And in the latter of these cases, it is not sufficient to refer to the battles of Rivoli and Wagram, to the attack of the Austrians on the theatre of war in Italy in 1796, or of the French upon the German theatre of war in the same year. The way in which these orders of battle or plans of attack essentially contributed to disastrous issues in those particular cases must be shown by closely tracing out circumstances and occurrences. Then it will appear how far such forms or measures are to be condemned, a point which it is very necessary to show, for a total condemnation would be inconsistent with truth. It has already been said that when circumstantial detail of facts is impossible, the demonstrative power which is deficient may, to a certain extent, be supplied by the number of cases quoted. But this is a very dangerous method of getting out of the difficulty, and one which has been much abused. Instead of one well-explained example, 3 or 4 are just touched upon, and thus a show is made of strong evidence. But there are matters where a whole dozen of cases brought forward would prove nothing if, for instance, they are facts of frequent occurrence, and therefore a dozen other cases with an opposite result might just as easily be brought forward. If any one will instance a dozen lost battles in which the side beaten attacked in separate converging columns, we can instance a dozen that have been gained in which the same order was adopted. It is evident that in this way no result is to be obtained. Upon carefully considering these different points, it will be seen how easily examples may be misapplied. An occurrence which, instead of being carefully analysed in all its parts, is superficially noticed, is like an object seen at a great distance, presenting the same appearance on each side, and in which the details of its parts cannot be distinguished. Such examples have in reality served to support the most contradictory opinions. To some, Daun's campaigns are models of prudence and skill, to others they are nothing but examples of timidity and want of resolution. Bonaparte's passage across the Noric Alps in 1797 may be made to appear the noblest resolution, but also as an act of sheer temerity. His strategic defeat in 1812 may be represented as the consequence either of an excess or of a deficiency of energy. All these opinions have been broached, and it is easy to see that they might well arise, because each person takes a different view of the connection of events. At the same time, these antagonistic opinions cannot be reconciled with each other, and therefore one of the two must be wrong. Much as we are obliged to the worthy Feuquieres for numerous examples introduced in his memoirs, partly because a number of historical incidents have thus been preserved which might otherwise have been lost, and partly because he was one of the first to bring theoretical, that is, abstract ideas into connection with the practical in war, insofar that the cases brought forward may be regarded as intended to exemplify and confirm what is theoretically asserted, yet, in the opinion of an impartial reader, he will hardly be allowed to have attained the object he proposed to himself, that of proving theoretical principles by historical examples, for although he sometimes relates occurrences with great minuteness, still he falls short, very often, of showing that the deductions drawn necessarily proceed from the inner relations of these events. Another evil which comes from the superficial notice of historical events is that some readers are either wholly ignorant of the events, or cannot call them to remembrance sufficiently to be able to grasp the author's meaning, so there is no alternative between either accepting blindly what is said, or remaining unconvinced. It is extremely difficult to put together or unfold historical events before the eyes of a reader in such a way as is necessary, in order to be able to use them as proofs, for the writer very often wants the means, and can neither afford the time nor the requisite space. But we maintain that, when the object is to establish a new or doubtful opinion, one single example thoroughly analysed is far more instructive than 10 which are superficially treated. The great mischief of these superficial representations is not that the writer puts his story forward as a proof, when it has only a false title, but that he has not made himself properly acquainted with the subject, and that from this sort of slovenly, shallow treatment of history, 100 false views and attempts at the construction of theories arise, which would never have made their appearance if the writer had looked upon it as his duty to deduce from the strict connection of events everything new which he brought to market, and sought to prove from history. When we are convinced of these difficulties in the use of historical examples, and at the same time of the necessity of making use of such examples, then we shall also come to the conclusion that the latest military history is naturally the best field from which to draw them, inasmuch as it alone is sufficiently authentic and detailed. In ancient times, circumstances connected with war, as well as the method of carrying it on, were different. Therefore, its events are of less use to us, either theoretically or practically, in addition to which military history, like every other, naturally loses in the course of time a number of small traits and lineaments originally to be seen, loses in colour and life like a worn-out or darkened picture, so that perhaps at last only the large masses and leading features remain, which thus acquire undue proportions. If we look at the present state of warfare, we should say that wars since that of the Austrian succession are almost the only ones which, at least as far as armament, have still a considerable similarity to the present, and which, notwithstanding the many important changes which have taken place, both great and small, are still capable of affording much instruction. It is quite otherwise with the War of the Spanish Succession, as the use of firearms had not then so far advanced towards perfection, and cavalry still continued the most important arm. The farther we go back, the less useful becomes military history, as it gets so much the more meagre and barren of detail. The most useless of all is that of the Old World. But this uselessness is not altogether absolute. It relates only to those subjects which depend on a knowledge of minute details, or on those things in which the method of conducting war has changed. Although we know very little about the tactics in the battles between the Swiss and the Austrians, the Burgundians and French, still we find in them unmistakable evidence that they were the first in which the superiority of a good infantry over the best cavalry was displayed. A general glance at the time of the Condottieri teaches us how the whole method of conducting war is dependent on the instrument used, for at no period have the forces used in war had so much the characteristics of a special instrument, and been a class so totally distinct from the rest of the national community. The memorable way in which the Romans in the Second Punic War attacked the Carthaginian possessions in Spain and Africa, while Hannibal still maintained himself in Italy, is a most instructive subject to study, as the general relations of the states and armies concerned in this indirect act of defence are sufficiently well known. But the more things descend into particulars, and deviate in character from the most general relations, the less we can look for examples and lessons of experience from very remote periods. For we have neither the means of judging properly of corresponding events, nor can we apply them to our completely different method of war. Unfortunately, however, it has always been the fashion with historical writers to talk about ancient times. We shall not say how far vanity and charlatanism may have had a share in this, but in general we fail to discover any honest intention and earnest endeavour to instruct and convince, and we can therefore only look upon such quotations and references as embellishments to fill up gaps and hide defects. It would be an immense service to teach the art of War entirely by historical examples, as Feuquieres proposed to do, but it would be full work for the whole life of a man, if we reflect that he who undertakes it must first qualify himself for the task by a long personal experience in actual war. Whoever, stirred by ambition, undertakes such a task, let him prepare himself for his pious undertaking as for a long pilgrimage. Let him give up his time, spare no sacrifice, fear no temporal rank or power, and rise above all feelings of personal vanity, of false shame, in order, according to the French code, to speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. End of Book 2, Chapter 6. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.